All right, so here's the deal. I started out in learning about this stuff in a master's in counseling, studying with David Kersey, who most of you may know, wrote a lot about temperament in a famous book called Please Understand Me. But this was long before the book, and the course was called, I can't remember what the name of it was, but it was a psychopathology class. In other words, it was a course in a counseling master's degree about what goes wrong when people aren't functioning very well. And this is always a multidisciplinary presentation. So one week we had a lecture on behavioral perspective, one on Carl Rogers' perspective on what goes wrong with people, variety of perspectives. And lo and behold, one night he talked about this way people go crazy, and that there were 4 ways. And go crazy is in quotes. So this is it's all from the spectrum from easy to, very simple stress responses to extreme stress responses that really need professional help to help with. And so out of that, there were 4 lectures. And at the end, they said, well, here's what it looks like when people are functioning well. 20 minutes out of 3 hours to well functioning, the rest to not functioning well. Then we were introduced to excuse me, to the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. And this was back in the day, not in an introduction, but if you want to find out which one of these fit you, you can take the Myers-Briggs. And they gave us let's see, this was 1975, I think. They gave us a mimeographed version. Didn't have photocopy machines in those days. Oh my gosh. So, so anyway, we had that opportunity. And and then we had another class on managing the counselor's function. And in that, we did quite a bit on the letters and what the type code meant. So here was this holistic model about people having difficulties, being dysfunctional and functional in the same way. And as Ernst Kretschmer put it, no, this is Linda's paraphrase of Ernst Kretschmer in the 1920s, it takes a certain talent to go crazy a certain way. So this whole holistic living systems view of people and what goes on. And then we had this instrument that looked at the letters, E versus I, S versus N, T versus F, J versus P. And David Kersey had been introduced to Isabel Myers. I won't give a whole history lesson here, but he took that and he found that INTP fit him really, really well. So that was like, somebody's been following me around. So he linked this theory with the Myers-Briggs, this holistic theory about why people do what they do, how they're functioning well and not so well, with the Myers-Briggs. So I got fascinated and started going to the Association for Psychological Types conferences in 1980, and every one since then. And what we encountered, which was something that David Kersey really objected to, even though he linked it to the type code, is that people were looking at parts. And you're born whole, you're conceived whole, you're conceived with a fertilized ovum, that's a single cell. And it divides and it divides and it divides, and these all divide. And as they divide, they differentiate and they take on different functions, different roles in your physiology. So when we look at E plus I and S plus N and T versus and J versus P, we're only looking at parts. And if we're identifying and help people trying to understand themselves, chances are somewhere around 40 to 80% of the time you're going to be inaccurate. And it's sort of in our nature, at least in Western culture, to think in parts of, this versus that, in dichotomies. And so that goes well, it's simple. And of course, in the end, if people understand that people are different and they start to cut people slack and understand each other, I'm not going to complain too much. But when people start getting misidentified and then they make career choices, or they start to treat their spouse as if they were somebody, and then it's totally opposite what that person needs. Now we have disruption in the relationships, and we have ill health coming from that. So we found that it's very important to understand that, yes, those dichotomies are useful. They give us a little bit of information, but the more we talk about one of them, the more we might be inaccurate. So sensing is one of those. So the name of the email that went out was, "You're not a sensor." Nobody's a sensor. We're all sensors. In other words, we sense into things in different ways. Now, Jung was using, or the translation of Jung was using the word sensor or sensation as a more tangible way, and it got translated into perception by way of the five senses. Okay, that is not what it means. It is more than that. Perception is a cognitive process. It's not a passive thing, it's active. And it's much more complex than just the five senses. So what I want to cover today and share with you is a little bit about what that type code means, in that it means more than adding up parts. And that what Jung talked about were 8 psychological types, 8 functions that go on in the psyche. And we know from Dario Nardi's research that they also go on in the brain. And you can detect the patterns of brain activity, not one brain area, but a pattern that go with these 8 processes that Jung described. And so way, way back in the 80s, I believe, then John Beebe and others started looking at what then became the 8 function model. So describing these 8 functions. So you're really not a sensor. You may be a sensing type, meaning that's what you lead with. But on the other hand, that still is a little misleading, because introverted sensing and extroverted sensing are a world apart. But I'm going on a little bit too much into history, as I'm prone to do. And I can't see all the pictures, so I can't tell how many of you fell asleep. So anyway, so let me share my screen a little bit and give you a little bit of presentation. And then after I've done that, we'll take a look at some specific type patterns. So we have this 4-letter type code. And what is often said, when I used to do Myers-Briggs type indicator qualifying programs back in the day, and before that, we would talk about the 2 middle letters are the heart of the type code. Now, if you're old enough, and I don't know if they still diagram sentences where you have a subject and a verb and an adjective and an adverb, think about these as the subject and the verb. They're the heart of the type code. And the other 2 are modifiers. So in my view, in my experience, the other 2, E versus I, and J, E or I or J or P, are modifiers. They're not something in and of themselves. With the exception, slight exception, of extroversion and introversion, because the longitudinal studies around that, with a different definition than Jung had, but close enough, is it's the most stable characteristic over time. But in my experience, whether you are in an extroverted mode or an introverted mode is dependent on which cognitive process you're using. So let me talk to you about that. Now, this is for the mathematicians and the people that like, screens and things like diagrams and stuff. So here we go. So Jung said there are perceiving processes. The way I like to talk about it as the kind of information we pay attention to. So perception is about attending to information. Whether it's internal or external is a different, that's another way we can take a look at that. But we're accessing information. And so the S or the N refers to that. It's the perceiving processes. I like to call them the awareness processes, to get it away from this idea of the five senses. And then there is T and F. The T and F is either thinking or feeling, which, by the way, is not a direct, not really the best translation from what I understand about what Jung meant, but I don't speak German enough to know. So, but it's a metaphor. It isn't about thinking or feeling. This is more of a metaphor for what we can talk about. And these are called judging processes. I prefer to call them evaluation processes. They're what do we do with that information? And we have preferences for one over the other. So when we look at the type code, here's what it looks like. The perceiving processes, there's sensing and intuiting. We change these to gerunds because they're active things. They're not nouns. You're not a sensor or an intuitor. You engage in these processes. And they can be used in the external world or the internal world. So in the type code language, it's SE or extroverted sensing, SI or introverted sensing, NE or NI. And that means that your awareness is internal, introverted, or external. And this happens so fast, these various awarenesses, that you're actually probably accessing one or two of these four processes, if not all four of them, in any particular moment, like the time we're together. So while I'm talking, you might be going inside and accessing what this reminds you of and checking against what was said to you before about this. Or maybe the sound of my voice is reminding you of somebody. And so, you're not here anymore. You're with somebody that it reminds you of. It might be a long time you're puzzling over it. It might be just a very short time. Or you might be engaging in extroverted sensing and listening to the tone of my voice, or what you see on the screen, or the sound of the fan that's going on in the other, around over here. I have a filter running, or something that flashes on your phone, or you're drawn out to what is going on in the external world and what is tangibly going on out there. Okay. If you're thinking about intuiting, and this is not the best word to use, but it's the one that's been used. Intuiting in Jung's frame is abstract information, conceptual information, symbolic information, something sort of like, it's almost the way to define it is the opposite of what is actually physically there or was there. Okay. So we have intuiting in the external world. When it's focused outward, it's about potentials, things that link to something to outside the context, something maybe a little unrelated, flight of ideas in a way that may come to you. And this builds on that, and this builds on the other thing. If you are in a moment of accessing intuitions or intuiting in this introverted way, you would probably prefer to do that without interacting with people. So, if that's when often these insights come. So a solution to a problem can come wholesale, or a symbol will present itself to you, or a knowing about something that's going to happen in the future. And it is going to happen in the future. So now we're so far away from you're a sensor, you're an intuitor, just with these very brief definitions. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about the other ones, but I want to focus on perceiving processes more. So we have judging processes. So what do you do with information? Now, perception doesn't always perceive judgment. In other words, awareness doesn't always perceive the judging process. You may have some information that you need to do something, to make a decision about it, and then you seek certain kinds. So it's like an interrelated loop. Okay, so there are two. One is called thinking and one is called feeling. Thinking doesn't mean thinking. I mean, it doesn't mean that you're able to think. Feeling doesn't necessarily mean feelings. In fact, it wasn't intended to mean that. Feelings inform what you call the feeling function, because that's how you know what those kinds of, that kind of evaluation process is about. It's what's important, what are the values, what's important to other people. So if I just stop over on the other side, if we go to the introverted version to make an evaluation, it's like, what's important? On a simple level, do I like it or not? Is it good for me? Might be, is it good for people? Sort of in a universal sense. On an extroverted sense of feeling, there's, we call it connecting. It's about connecting with others. So the focus is on what's good for you, what's good for the other person, what do they want, more often than the internal, what do I want? Very simplistic definition here. It's much richer than that. With thinking, then you're evaluating something based on either external data, measurement, logic, external logic, or that's externally, or internally, you're looking at the frameworks that you hold that are objective frameworks that you can explain in some sort of a model. Okay, so thinking in the sense that they're detached from feelings, and feeling in the sense that feelings give you information about that. So when you're with somebody and they start to cry, this is a little bit about empathy, so, and some brain stuff that isn't necessarily what I'm talking about here. So we all do that. But in this cognitive process of extroverted feeling, you get a sense and you may know what this person needs at the moment. So it's not so much the feeling of the crying as it is the knowing what to do in connection with that person. By the way, these are workshop. The booklet is the one we have here, and that's the pages in the workbook that we use. Okay, so this is the mechanical piece. So let's take a look at what else we can look at with this. So what we have then are these 8 functions. Well, they're different cognitive processes so they're organized in a certain pattern. And what does this letter on the end, the J and P? J and P does nothing but point. So if you have a P on the end of your code, that stands for perceiving. And that means that it points to which process you would use in the external world. So if there's SP in your code, you're likely to prefer the extroverted sensing as a way of dealing with the world most of the time. If there's an N on the code, that would mean that you're likely to prefer seeing patterns and connections, emerging patterns, and seeing how something here relates to something looks like it's not related at all. All right, so that's what the P tells you. If there's a J on the end of the code, then that tells you that the judging process that's in the code is used in the external world. So if it's extroverted thinking, then that tells you that you're looking at external logic, measurement, constructing things, systems, things like that. If there's an F on the code, that means that you tend to live your outer life with connecting, with wanting to have connections, with making decisions about what's good for you, what's good for the group. But what happens to the other letters? What else is there? So the E and the I don't have a graphic for this. So if the E and I, if there's an E on the front of the code, it tells you that whatever process, let's see if I can point this out, is extroverted is the one that you will favor, because you might prefer to live in the external world. So if it's an ESP in the code, that's not ESP, but ESTRFP, then extroverted sensing is what you would lead with. And then the other one that's in the code would be used in an introverted manner. So the type code tells you, just with that information, it tells you mostly what kinds of activities you're likely to prefer to engage in your external world and in your internal world. Okay. So it was pretty easy for me to talk and just to get that sense of here's what so you have an internal process and an external process. The type code kicks off an understanding of the pattern of what do you lead with and what do you support with. But there's more, which we'll get into in just a minute. But I want to give you another little sense. I had a note that it was helpful when I talked about extroverted sensing and introverted sensing. And I said, this is what you might be doing. If you were in the extroverted intuiting mode, you might be thinking about, I wonder if she's ever thought about how this connects to something else. And I like this thing, this graphic thing. I think there would be lots of possibilities for using this in some other setting. So here's some ideas that I have. So kind of a brainstorming on ideas that are outside the context, not in the context. If it's introverted intuiting, if you're there, you may have spaced out a little bit and gone into a different world and sort of disconnected and had some ideas that come to you about some problem you've been working on elsewhere, and this trigger is enough to trigger you thinking about that, or something symbolic. You may have had an idea about a different way to present this whole thing that popped into your head. Okay. Very simplistic. All right, so those are the four. Let's see if I can do the extroverted thinking, introverted thinking, extroverted feeling ones. So if you're new to this process, you might be saying, so what's the research around this? How do we know? The Myers-Briggs has done EISNTFJP for years, lots of research data. At least if you're in one of the early qualifying programs, you had to memorize and learn a bunch of stuff about that. And so you might be looking for some external measures. Or you might say, wow, I like this configuration here. This is really a logical explanation. Now, you don't have to have a preference for any of these to have that mental activity going on. This is just an example of the kind of activity. So introverted thinking. Well, is what she's saying accurate? This is what I learned what that meant. This doesn't match what I learned before. Is it accurate? Or maybe she could define this a little more finely, because I think that's a fuzzy definition. So going internal to your frameworks and checking for consistency. If it's extroverted feeling, looking outward to connecting, you might be wondering how other people are feeling in the moment. You may see somebody's expression on their face, or you may notice that Stephanie went off screen for a while and think, oh my gosh, what's she doing? I hope she's didn't hurt herself. I don't know, it's whatever you can think of that. And so for me, what happens is I'm saying, I've been doing a lot of lecturing now. This isn't enough. We have to stop lecturing. We have to get more involvement. So I'm using two things: concern for my participants, you guys, and the frameworks I have about good design. All right, so now, if you had this feeling process introverted going on for you, you may say, wow, this is profoundly important. This is good. We need to spread this word. Or you might say, well, what she just said isn't really congruent with the way she's behaving. It seems like she's respecting this, but she doesn't, or some kind of incongruence. So does that help? Hopefully. All right. Okay, so there's that one. Let me see what's next. Okay, well, so there's this whole idea of the external world and the internal world, and each process happens there. And then we have these four. So I did talk to you about those. And here's another way we like to present that. So with a little more detail. We like to use the terms for extroverted sensing about experiencing and noticing. For introverted sensing, we like to talk about it as reviewing. And what you're reviewing is what's going on inside. Extroverted intuiting, we talk about it as interpreting. You're interpreting something and inferring what it means. And with introverted intuiting, we call it foreseeing. It's also, I don't have a good word for it, but it's about symbolizing. It's like the symbols come to you. Okay, so these are some of the meanings. And each of these processes is used in an extroverted or an introverted way. And we could do the same for the other functions. And I think that's the end of, oh, okay. So let me stop here and find out what questions you may have, which leads me to kind of another point about each of these processes. They range from simplistic and basic to extremely sophisticated and archetypal. So when we're young, we're using them in a more simplistic way, usually. So this introverted thinking is about getting to the essence of something, noticing what it really is, what are the essential qualities of it. And in a simple way, you're checking against frameworks that you already know. And of course, once they're in there, it takes a crowbar sometimes to make room for a new one, says somebody who knows well. That it needed a crowbar a few times. Even to the point of having to give up my favorite models. In the more sophisticated ways, it's really about analyzing things in such a way that you drill down into what is at the essence of it, and hopefully find a single word that will convey that essence. And that's true for introverted feeling in terms of like the level of sophistication of the values that you're looking at. First, it's the values you've taken on, and then you start to see more and more finer distinctions of valuing. So we call it valuing, and we call introverted thinking analyzing. Anything else? So I'm wondering, so what happens is you have these 8 processes, and the holistic systems view is that these 8 processes are in a pattern. They're in a configuration in the personality, in the way that they, in relationship to each other. So living systems, to understand a living system, you have to look at the pattern. And the pattern is what stays the same over time. You can look at processes, which are activities that maintain the pattern. And then you can look at structures. And then you can look at meanings. So when Dario Nardi did the brain research, he's looking at some structures that support the pattern and how that plays out. And what we know is the brain is plastic, meaning it's shapeable. And so with experiences, you can change what the brain does, what the activities are in certain situations. And yet underneath that, what Dario is finding is that there's still the essence of the original pattern, even though a certain area of the brain might have been developed, where that's typical of other activities. Okay, now there's something else. Yeah, so what John Beebe identified and what Jung hinted at, and what Isabel Myers, when she developed the Myers-Briggs type indicator, also got at a little bit when they identified their interpretation of Jung, she and her mother, was that there was a dominant process and an auxiliary process. And then they started to identify a tertiary process and an inferior process. And of course, a lot of what was written is that the inferior was inferior in quality. And then the rest of it, well, that's just there. It's in shadow. We don't do anything with it. John Beebe identified that there are these 8 cognitive processes, which I showed you the letters of, occur in a pattern naturally, and that each process is likely to play a role in the personality, a specific kind of role. So one, and that was the next slide, but I'll just tell you and then I'll show you the slide. So one tends to play a heroic role. And the positive side of that, that's the kind of process that you use habitually. You're probably skilled at it because you've practiced it. And it's often the kinds of things you do to save the day. And who doesn't want to be a hero? So we try to apply that to other things, and then the downside can be dominating. So for me, my pattern, introverted thinking, is my leading role. And it plays a heroic role at times, as I've clarified. Oh, this is this and this is that, and this is not that. And we have all this whole business here. But darn it, sometimes I'm just so frustrated because I know I'm right. And then I put that on other people. And I did that in the Association for Psychological Type for a long time. And I said, you're wrong. People don't like to hear that, so that didn't work too well. But it's a dominating thing. So there's a plus side and a negative side. And for the processes that he called the primary processes, they tend to be more positive, but they can get into the negative. So there's that. Tertiary, he called, oh, come on, I have to share it to really get it. There we go. So the size of the font has to do with kind of how much, what's the role. So the leading role, heroic, hero, whatever term you want to use. Supporting role, it's a good parent. It's the way you help people. Relief role will be the form you might take to play a lot. It gives you relaxation, creative child. And then there's the aspirational role, which is the idealized self, and it's what you want to do. So for example, in my pattern, INTP, I talked to you about this heroic introverted thinking or analyzing. But what I aspire to, this idealized self, is to connect with others and to know what to say to people, to make them feel okay or good, and to have a good experience. And so there's this aspirational self. And so the way the type development theory goes is you start off early in life. If everything's equal and you're able to do what it is that you prefer to do, what the natural preference is, the natural inclination, is you develop this leading role and you get more and more skilled at it because you're drawn to those kinds of activities. And then the supporting role, according to some type theorists and observations, does tend to emerge more as you go into your teen years, maybe a little earlier. But they're there playing all the time. And Elizabeth Murphy, who works with children, said she thinks we really haven't had good descriptions of what it looks like in children. So she's done a lot of research with children. The relief role often comes into play according to this one developmental theory, in young adulthood. And so we start to see these other kinds of things. And then somewhere around whatever was called midlife comes the aspirational role. And so that's often, we'll see midlife crisis happening and having to do with that, or choosing a career in young adulthood that goes with the relief role, but process, whatever process is there, but then getting bored with that or finding it isn't really as satisfying as we thought. So all of these things. And then the other four processes play roles. When we need them to, we can dip into them. But they have these other roles. One is the oppositional self. That's the way we get stubborn. Critical parent role is the way we tend to be critical of ourselves mostly. Like that particular process we can't measure up with. The deceiving role, Phoebe called it the trickster archetype. It's like, if only I can do this, it's going to be so much fun. It's going to solve everything and all that stuff. And then the devilish role is when you get to say the devil made me do it. It's you get caught up in whatever process that is. So in the courses, I tell some very revealing stories about that and get people to find those things. Is the sequence of process development variable? Yes, the sequence of development has a lot to do with what's going on and what you need to survive or to do well. So I think it is variable. This one theory was, and I cannot remember the guy's name, but anyway, there was a theory that really kind of put these with ages. And when I look at all of the people I've known over the years who could talk about this, who know their type well enough, it seems to hold true, and I could track it in myself. But it's certainly not a prescription. It's not it's always going to be in this sequence. The question came, what circumstances could you use this to help people negotiate? If you're wondering that, is that F-E or G-E? It depends on the motive behind it. If it's a desire to connect, or is it the desire to put order on the external world? As I considered absorbing. I don't know. And I don't know what might be excavating. Interesting. Other words. I may have to open up my categories a little. We'll see. Okay. All right. So I'll just go on and share this really quick, and then let's see if you can. So this is my type code, and I've talked about it. So we have the prime. We like to do a stick figure because there are two processes that work on the spine, what Bibi called the spine of the personality. And if you understand chakras, that's where the energy flows. And if you happen to favor chiropractic practices, you know that if things are flowing in the spine, then the healing energy is getting out to the rest. So there are all kinds of this importance of the analogy to the spine of the personality. So in the pattern, my leading role is analyzing. I almost cannot not do that. It's hard to turn it off. And then the aspirational role is connecting. So paying a lot of attention to worrying about, often more than behaving in a way that is connected. Are the learners in my courses getting what they need? Are they comfortable sharing? Have I set a safe environment? Those kinds of things seem to come from that. But they could also come from the principles I've learned about good training. That it's a strong desire. Okay. Supporting role is interpreting in this pattern. So it's about if something's going on and somebody's troubled, I'm most likely to try to think of other options for their actions, or what could they do. And then the relief role is reviewing, which is why I sometimes get stuck in the stories about history, and may or may not be what's relevant at the moment when I tell you all of the details. So stereotypically, INTP in the type language says that I'm not into details. Isn't true. The kinds of details I'm into are details about theories and models and about all of the contributing factors to something that come from past experiences. So another type might be interested in details that have to do with what you're actually seeing. And I've had some training in that. So if I'm doing coaching with somebody, I'm watching their faces and I'm watching their nonverbal behavior. I've learned to do that, had to be taught to do that, because that's what is in my shadow processes. So the devilish for me is introverted feeling, getting stuck in something I want. Deceiving is extroverted sensing. I don't trust my insights into the future. That sometimes they're really powerful as a critical parent thing. And I'm somehow, when I get something organized, don't mess with it. Physically organized. That's the segmenting. So I get stubborn that way. So there's a whole story that we can tell about how these processes are in our pattern once you get to the best fit pattern. So if you think about your own pattern, what you know about that, what questions have come up, what insights came to you,